The first time anyone heard the voices in the hollow, they thought it was just the wind curling through the branches, the kind of sound that comes from places too old and too forgotten to welcome visitors. But as the nights deepened and the darkness thickened around the trees, it became clear those whispers carried shape, intention, and something far older than language. By the time the townsfolk realized what they were hearing, the woods had already claimed more than what it was ever willing to return. Long before the disappearances, before the strange lights drifted between the pines like wounded souls, there were the Williams twins, Elias and Elijah, born under a moon so thin it could barely cast a shadow. People said they entered the world holding each other's hands, and they never let go after that. Even as children they moved as one, spoke as one, breathed as one. They learned early that the world feared what it did not understand, and soon enough they stopped trying to be understood at all. Their father kept them hidden in the heart of those pine-choked woods, claiming the town was poisoning their minds with suspicion. But behind closed doors, even he whispered that the twins were bound by something not entirely human. He'd seen them stare at each other for hours without blinking, as if they were listening to a conversation no one else could hear. He'd seen one boy cut his palm with a knife only to watch the same fresh wound appear on the other's hand moments later. On their 19th birthday, while the rest of the county slept uneasily, the twins vanished beneath a veil of fog and returned before dawn with something cold and permanent in their eyes. They spoke of vows taken under a dead oak, vows that bound them not just to each other but to the forest itself. It was the first whisper of the wedding that should never have happened, the one that would give birth to a lineage so twisted the trees themselves seemed to recoil. By the time the first strange child was born, people had already started avoiding the hollow. The cries drifting from the Williams homestead didn't sound like they belonged to a baby, and whatever answered those cries didn't sound human at all. Hunters returned pale and trembling, claiming they saw figures in the underbrush mimicking their voices a heartbeat after they spoke. Others never returned at all. The woods grew darker after that, darker in a way lanterns could not fix. And on certain nights, when the fog pressed low and the moon hid its face, the voices came again, layered, desperate, too many to count. Some begged for help. Some whispered warnings. But two voices always rose above the rest, perfectly matched, perfectly synchronized, forever entwined. The voices of the twins. The first ancestors of the most inbred bloodline the hollow would ever know. And if you listen from the tree lean long enough, you'll hear them calling still. The birth of the Williams twins was remembered not because of celebration or joy, but because of the terrifying stillness that swept through the homestead the moment they entered the world. Their mother, pale and trembling, labored through a cold October night when the sky seemed to hang unnaturally low, pressing down on the roof like a silent warning. Neighbors who lived a mile away claimed later that their lantern flames shivered inward, as if pulled toward something unseen. The animals sensed it first, the horses kicked in their stalls, dogs whimpered beneath porches, and even the owls avoided their usual calls. It was as though the entire valley held its breath, waiting for something it already feared. Inside the cabin, the midwife who had delivered dozens of children over 30 years found herself frozen in place the moment she laid eyes on the emerging infants. She would later refuse to speak of what she felt, only muttering that the air around them was too cold, and that she'd never again help bring life into such a cursed hour. When the twins finally came, they arrived not crying, but silent, wrapped together in a way that made it difficult to tell where one ended and the other began. Their tiny hands were clasped so tightly the midwife had to pry them apart, and when she did, a sudden gust rattled every window in the house. She claimed their eyes opened at the same moment, turning toward her with an unsettling awareness no newborn should possess. They didn't blink, didn't squirm, didn't make a sound. Instead, they stared with matching expressions that made the midwife back away until she nearly toppled over her own bag. She whispered that they shared a single breath, that their chests rose and fell in perfect sync, as though one heartbeat controlled both bodies. Word spread quickly, carried by frightened gossip and trembling whispers. In small towns, tales grow fast, and this one grew faster than most. Some said the twins were a bad omen. Others insisted their birth signaled an ancient curse finally waking. A few believed the woods had chosen them, marked them, or perhaps created them for its own purposes. The midwife never returned to the Williams home. She packed her belongings at dawn and left the valley altogether, leaving behind only one chilling warning to the family she fled from: keep the boys away from mirrors and keep them far from the dark parts of the forest where the wind doesn't blow. Their father tried to pretend the rumors were foolishness, but even he found himself watching the twins with a tension he couldn't disguise. The boys rarely cried, rarely slept, and always instinctively sought each other, their fingers curling together as though they feared being separated. It was clear to everyone who saw them that something entered the world that night that did not entirely belong to it. From the moment the Williams twins could walk, people noticed something unsettling about the way they moved. It wasn't just the identical steps or mirrored gestures, it was the eerie sense that they weren't two separate boys at all, but one mind stretched thin between two bodies. When one scraped his knee running through the yard, the other would gasp and clutch his own leg even if he had been nowhere near the accident. Their mother once witnessed Elijah flinch before Elias even fell, as though he felt the future bruising before it happened. At first, the family tried to ignore these incidents, chalking them up to closeness or coincidence, but the frequency made denial impossible. The twins weren't just similar, they were connected in ways that defied every rule of nature. Their communication was the first thing that frightened their father. He'd find them sitting cross-legged beneath the old willow tree, staring at each other in absolute silence for hours. No whispers, no gestures, no childish giggles, just a stillness far too deep for boys their age. Yet somehow they always seemed to know exactly what the other wanted. If one stood, the other rose instantly. If one reached for a toy, the other's hand was already moving. Their mother tried to encourage them to play separately, placing them in different rooms, but within minutes they would drift back together as though pulled by an invisible thread. They didn't cry when apart, instead, they grew eerily quiet, their faces tense and unfocused, as if listening to something no one else could hear. The strangest moments happened at night. On several occasions their mother awoke to find both boys standing beside her bed, side by side, their eyes wide open but their expressions vacant. They spoke in unison without hesitation, finishing each other's sentences like a single voice split into two tones. Their father once heard them laughing through the walls, an identical, layered sound, and when he entered their room, they were sitting on opposite sides of the floor, staring directly at each other while laughing without moving their mouths. He left the room trembling, unable to decide whether they were playing or communing with something he couldn't understand. By the time they turned 10, the twins shared more than thoughts. They shared dreams. They would wake at the same moment, describing the same visions, a shadowed clearing in the woods where the trees bent inward, a voice whispering without a source, a feeling of belonging that terrified their parents. When questioned, they didn't seem afraid. Instead, they spoke of the dream place as if it were calling them home. Their bond, already unnaturally strong, only deepened with each shared vision. It became clear that whatever connected them wasn't fading with age, it was growing, tightening around them like a vine, shaping them into something the rest of the world had no language for. Their father made the decision to move the family into the deeper stretch of the forest long before anyone could question him, though most believed the pressure of the town's whispers finally pushed him too far. Rumors were beginning to spread at a pace he couldn't outrun, stories of the twins' strange connection, their silent staring sessions under the willow tree, the way they spoke in unison without a single word exchanged aloud. People in small towns feared what they didn't understand, and the Williams twins were becoming the center of every hushed conversation. Mothers tugged their children closer when the boys passed, shopkeepers avoided meeting their eyes, and even the church elders muttered that some things were born wrong and needed to be kept away from the world. Their father, already a proud but weary man, realized the town wasn't going to let them live in peace. At first, he told himself he was protecting his sons from cruelty, giving them space to grow without judgment. But deep down, he was running, from the stares, from the suspicions, and from his own growing unease. Late at night, he'd find the boys standing in the hallway, perfectly still, their faces turned toward the dark window as though listening to something calling them from outside. It didn't feel like normal childhood behavior, and no matter how much he tried to rationalize it, dread settled in his stomach like a stone. Moving into the woods seemed like the only way to shield them from the world and perhaps shield the world from them. The new homestead was several miles beyond the last cabin on the edge of town, swallowed by tall pines that blocked out most of the sky. The forest there carried a quiet thickness, the kind that made footsteps sound heavier and breaths feel louder. The boys didn't seem frightened by the isolation. In fact, they seemed drawn to it, as if the trees themselves recognized them. They wandered deeper each day, slipping between the trunks with an unsettling sense of familiarity. Their mother would call out for them at dusk, and they would return without a word, dirt on their hands, their expressions unreadable. What unsettled their father most was how quickly the twins adapted to the solitude. They never complained of loneliness. They never asked about the children they once played near, nor did they miss the world outside the tree line. Instead, they watched the woods with an almost reverent calm, their heads tilting in perfect synchrony whenever a branch snapped or a crow cried overhead. It was as if they had always belonged to the forest, and the forest had simply been waiting for them to come home. The deeper they lived within those pines, the more their strange bond seemed to strengthen, and the more their father feared that whatever connected them was rooted in something far older, and far darker, than anything the town had ever whispered about. The first disappearance began like nothing more than childish curiosity, the kind that pulls young boys toward trouble long before they understand the consequences. A local kid named Matthew Crowder had always been fascinated by the Williams twins, even when the other children avoided them. He wasn't afraid of their silent games or their mirrored movements. Instead, he thought they were strange in the way animals are strange, something to observe, something to puzzle over. When the Williams family vanished into the deeper woods, Matthew's curiosity only grew. He'd watch from a distance as Elias and Elijah moved through the tree line, slipping between shadows like creatures born there rather than boys raised in a cabin. To him, they looked fearless, and he mistook that fearlessness for something worth following. On the day he went missing, Matthew had been seen trailing behind the twins near the creek bed that marked the unofficial boundary between the civilized world and the part of the forest no one dared to map. Witnesses later said the twins didn't seem surprised to see him. They turned toward him at the same moment, their expressions calm, their posture strangely welcoming, almost as if they had expected him all along. Whatever unspoken communication passed between the three boys, it was enough to make Matthew step into the woods after them without hesitation. Hours passed before anyone realized he was gone, and by then the forest had already swallowed any sign of him. His parents, frantic and desperate, alerted the sheriff, who arrived with bloodhounds and lanterns, ready to search every inch of the surrounding land. But the dogs refused to go near the tree line. They whimpered, tails tucked, pulling hard against their handlers as though something inside the woods repelled them. One dog even collapsed, trembling violently, refusing to move until it was dragged back toward the road. It was the first time in the sheriff's career that trained hounds had behaved that way, and he never forgot it. The Williams twins were questioned, but their answers offered no help. They claimed Matthew had walked home earlier and insisted they hadn't seen him after that. Their voices were calm, steady, eerily synchronized. The sheriff felt a chill listening to them, a creeping sense that the boys weren't lying in a normal way, they were simply describing reality as they understood it, a reality where Matthew's disappearance was no more significant than a leaf falling from a branch. Neighbors whispered that the twins had lured him into the forest, that something in those deep pines wanted another child, that the boys were merely the ones chosen to bring him there. And though no evidence ever surfaced, no footprints, no torn fabric, no sign of struggle, everyone agreed on one thing: whatever happened to Matthew occurred in the part of the forest where the air felt wrong and the silence seemed to listen, and once something crossed into that darkness, it never came back. The night the twins held their forbidden wedding, the forest felt unnaturally awake, as though every tree leaned in to witness something it had been expecting for years. They were 19, old enough to understand the weight of what they were doing but too bound to each other to care about consequences or the laws of the world. Their parents had long sensed something growing between them, something that went beyond the uncanny bond of shared thoughts and mirrored wounds. It was an attachment that tightened with each passing year, becoming a force neither boy resisted and no outside influence could weaken. When whispers in town reached their father, rumors that the boys were seen holding hands in ways that made adults uneasy, he prayed the forest's isolation would protect them. But the woods did not smother their connection, it nurtured it. On the night of the ceremony, a thick fog rolled in, swallowing the cabin and muting every sound except the faint, steady rhythm of the twins' synchronized footsteps. They slipped quietly from their beds and walked deeper into the trees, guided by the memory of dreams they had shared since childhood. Dreams of a clearing beneath a dead oak, a place they described as sacred even though neither could explain why. Lantern light flickered across their faces, casting twin shadows that merged and stretched like a single figure. Some said later the fog that night didn't drift like normal mist but curled deliberately, almost protectively, around their path. When they reached the clearing, the moon seemed to dim, leaving only the white skeleton of the dead oak towering above them. Its branches hung low, twisted like fingers reaching toward the twins as they stood face to face. There were no witnesses, no officiant, no human presence to bless or forbid the act. Yet the air felt crowded, dense with a presence that made the hairs on their arms rise. They spoke their vows in soft, identical tones, promising eternity not in metaphor but in certainty. The forest responded with a groan from the oak, a sound deep and resonant enough to vibrate through the ground. When the vows were sealed, the fog surged once more, swirling around them like an unseen congregation exhaling in satisfaction. By dawn, strange signs had already begun spreading through nearby homesteads. Livestock were found dead or behaving wildly, eyes rolling white, bodies thrashing as though spooked by something their owners couldn't see. Horses refused to approach the tree line, and roosters crowed hours before sunrise, disturbed by a change in the air. Those who lived closest to the Williams property awoke to voices drifting through the woods, two voices layered perfectly, speaking words no one could decipher but repeating them with chilling harmony that lingered long after the sound faded. The forbidden wedding was never openly discussed, but everyone who sensed the shift knew something irreversible had taken place under that dead oak, something that bound the twins not only to each other but to whatever ancient force had been waiting for them in the heart of the hollow. The birth of the twins' first child was an event that rattled the homestead in a way no storm or tragedy ever had. Their mother had carried the baby in unsettling silence, no cravings, no morning sickness, no typical signs of pregnancy, just a growing heaviness in her body that she described as something watching from the inside. The air in the cabin grew stale as the months passed, thick enough that visitors complained of headaches and nausea within minutes of stepping inside. The twins themselves grew quieter, more intense, spending hours touching the mother's stomach with a reverence that unsettled even their own parents. They whispered in tones too low for anyone else to hear, and sometimes the mother swore she felt two distinct pulses inside her, not the heartbeat of a child, but something else responding to the voices of its fathers. Labor began just before dawn, starting with a scream so sharp it sliced through the fog outside like a blade. The father rushed to gather blankets, but the moment he approached the bedside, the lantern flame flickered violently and went out, plunging the room into near darkness. The only light came from the crackling fireplace, and even those flames twisted strangely, pulling toward the bed as though drawn by something inside it. The birth happened faster than anyone expected. One moment there was the ragged sound of the mother's breathing, and the next, utter silence, a silence so sudden it made the father's blood run cold. The child didn't cry when it emerged. Instead, it let out a soft, gurgling sound that didn't resemble any newborn's voice. When the father finally saw it, he stepped back so abruptly he nearly fell. The baby looked human, but something was off, not grotesquely, not violently, but subtly. Its eyes were too focused, too aware, locking onto each face in the room with a precision no infant should have. Its fingers curled and uncurled with a slow, deliberate rhythm, as if testing the air. And the moment Elias and Elijah approached, the baby's gaze sharpened, recognizing them in a way that suggested an intelligence far beyond its few minutes of life. The most disturbing ability revealed itself later that night. As the family tried to rest, a voice echoed through the cabin, gentle, familiar. It was the mother's voice calling for water. But she was asleep. Then came another voice, the father's, repeating a phrase he'd spoken hours earlier. When they followed the sound, they found the infant curled in its crib, tiny lips moving with perfect accuracy, mimicking voices it had heard only once. Even more chilling was the mimicry of people long dead, voices belonging to ancestors no one had mentioned in years. The twins stood over the crib, unafraid, exchanging a knowing look that made their father's skin crawl. To them, their child wasn't unnatural, it was the fulfillment of something they had always awaited. To everyone else, it was the first undeniable sign that the family they were creating existed outside the boundaries of the human world. As the years passed, the Williams clan grew in number, each new child arriving with traits that pushed them further from anything the valley would ever recognize as normal. The firstborn's voice-mimicking ability had seemed impossible enough, but the next children displayed their own unsettling gifts, some unnervingly quiet, others too perceptive, some with eyes that didn't quite reflect the light correctly. None of them cried the way ordinary infants did. Instead, they hummed low, vibrating tones that rose in eerie unison when they were near one another, creating a harmony that sent chills through anyone who heard it. Their bodies were pale as the moonlight that filtered through the pines, and their movements carried an unnatural precision, as if their limbs had learned coordination long before their minds should have known how. The homestead grew cramped with the number of children, yet the twins never appeared overwhelmed. They raised them with a chilling calm, speaking to them in the same whispering language they had used since childhood, a language no outsider could decipher. The children responded immediately, turning their heads in perfect synchronization toward their father's voices as if following commands slow and invisible to everyone else. Their mother watched them with a strained mixture of awe and terror, her eyes hollowing with each passing season. She loved them because they were family, but she feared them because they were not like anything she had ever imagined having in her arms. At night, she listened to them walking in the halls in perfectly coordinated steps, their soft humming drifting like a chant she couldn't block out. As the family expanded, stories began to circulate among travelers and hunters who passed through the edge of the forest. People spoke of pale figures glimpsed between the trees, standing too still or moving too gracefully, their heads turning in perfect unison toward any sound. Some claimed the children watched silently from the shadows, mimicking wildlife calls with uncanny accuracy, imitating owls, wolves, or even human voices that echoed through the pines long after the originals faded. Others insisted that the children's eyes reflected light like animals when lantern beams swung across the underbrush. No one ever saw all the children at once, but everyone agreed the figures always appeared in groups, their bodies aligned in symmetrical patterns that made the forest feel staged, as though the trees themselves were part of some larger choreography. What frightened travelers most was the consistency of the sightings. No matter the season, no matter the hour, the figures always seemed to be there, waiting, watching, almost anticipating the presence of outsiders. Those who ventured deeper swore the children were guiding them somewhere, stepping silently between trunks and glancing back with expressions that were neither welcoming nor threatening, just expectant. The woods were no longer merely a home for the Williams family, they had become an extension of them, a living maze that responded to their movements and protected their secrets. And as the children grew older, their presence in the forest became impossible to ignore, marking the beginning of a bloodline that moved with one mind and one purpose, a family shaped by the unnatural bond that had started with the twins and now radiated through every child they brought into the world. As the Williams family withdrew further from society, their homestead slowly transformed from a place on the map to a whispered myth murmured around lantern-lit tables. No one ventured near it anymore, not even the bravest hunters or the most desperate travelers. The forest surrounding their property took on a presence of its own, a silence so suffocating that even birds avoided flying over it. Locals began calling the place Voice Hollow, a name born from stories of unnatural whispers drifting through the trees, carrying words that didn't belong to wind or wildlife. The name spread quietly at first, spoken hesitantly, almost fearfully, as though saying it aloud might call something out of the woods. What fueled the legend wasn't just the strange children or the forbidden lineage, it was the sound that lived in the forest. People who passed anywhere near the hollow reported hearing voices layered like a chorus, soft at first, then unmistakable as human. Some described them as pleas for help, others as warnings, and a few swore the voices knew their names, calling them with unsettling familiarity. The eerie echoes seemed to come from all directions at once, making it impossible to pinpoint their source. Lanterns flickered when the voices intensified, and even the bravest travelers admitted they felt watched by unseen eyes. The woods had become a place where sound behaved like a living creature, bending and twisting with intent. The stories deepened when a trapper returned to town trembling, claiming he heard children laughing in the dark despite seeing no one around. Their laughter sounded synchronized, almost harmonious, like a chorus rehearsed 1,000 times. As he hurried away, the trees behind him seemed to rustle in patterns too deliberate to be natural. Another traveler insisted that he heard the voice of his dead mother calling to him from deep within the trees, mimicked perfectly, drawing him toward the shadows until he snapped out of it and fled. Word spread quickly that the hollow could imitate any voice it wanted, whether from memory, fear, or some other unknown source. By then, Northwest One doubted the place was cursed. The air inside the hollow felt heavier than the rest of the forest, dense with something unseen. Even the ground seemed wrong, too soft, too cold, as if something beneath the soil had been disturbed. Those who dared approach claimed the trees leaned unnaturally inward, creating archways that looked like entrances into another world. At dusk, faint shapes could be seen moving in perfect unison, pale and slow, gliding between trunks with an eerie grace. People insisted the Williams children lived within the forest now more than the cabin, blending with the shadows so seamlessly that the boundary between the family and the woods no longer existed. Over time, the name Voice Hollow became synonymous with danger, a place that swallowed wanderers and returned only echoes. The valley grew accustomed to avoiding that part of the woods entirely, but no amount of distance could silence the whispers that drifted out on windless nights, reminding everyone that the hollow was alive, listening, and never truly empty. The disappearance of the search party marked the moment the valley finally understood that whatever had taken root in Voice Hollow was no longer simply a family living in isolation but something that had evolved into a force beyond human reach. 5 hunters, men known for their toughness, for their ability to track wounded animals through blizzards and navigate the darkest ridges without lanterns, volunteered to investigate after a series of unsettling sightings near the tree line. They carried rifles, hunting knives, and enough supplies to last several days. They believed the stories were exaggerated, nothing more than frightened gossip. But even as they joked and prepared for the trek, a quiet dread lingered between them, the kind that comes from entering a place you already suspect does not want you. The men reached the boundary of Voice Hollow just before dusk, and the instant they stepped beyond the first ring of trees, the forest swallowed their voices. Even their footsteps seemed absorbed into the earth, leaving behind no echo. The deeper they ventured, the more unnatural the silence became, thick and suffocating, pressing against their ears like cotton. Birds vanished. Insects went quiet. The only sound was the faint rustle of something moving just out of sight, always behind them, never ahead. The hunters kept glancing over their shoulders, whispering that they felt watched, though none could agree on how many eyes they sensed. As night fell, they saw pale shapes drifting between the trees. The figures were small, child-sized, but their movements were too synchronized to belong to normal children. Whenever one hunter turned his lantern toward them, the shapes vanished, only to reappear farther back, closer, as if studying the men. At one point the hunters heard their own voices echoing through the woods, repeating conversations they had spoken moments earlier in tones that were slightly wrong, like echoes spoken by someone learning how to mimic speech. One man insisted he heard his late brother call his name from behind a thicket, soft and pleading. Another claimed he saw footprints appear in the mud ahead of them, perfectly spaced, leading deeper into the hollow. Despite their experience, the men soon realized they were lost. Every direction looked the same, every trail looped back on itself, and the trees seemed to shift subtly when they weren't looking. Panic set in by the second night. Their supplies dwindled, lanterns flickered, and the voices grew louder, layered, discordant, whispering words that made no sense but carried a chilling familiarity. The last anyone heard from the hunters was a distant scream followed by a sudden silence that swallowed the sound completely. Days later, a farmer found their rifles neatly stacked at the base of a twisted pine several miles from where the search had begun. There were no footprints, no torn clothing, no signs of struggle, just 5 weapons arranged with deliberate care, as though someone had placed them there intentionally. The implication was clear: the men had walked into the hollow, and something had walked out without them. The final recording was discovered years later, buried beneath a loose floorboard in the decaying homestead, a relic left behind by a team of paranormal researchers who had vanished without a trace. The tape itself was unassuming, a thin strip of magnetic film, yet when played it revealed a nightmare etched in sound. From the very first seconds, the room seemed to chill, the air thickening as a dozen overlapping voices rose in a dissonant chorus. Some were pleading, soft and desperate, as if begging for help, repeating fragments of names and phrases that made no immediate sense. Others were harsher, whispering threats and warnings, layered atop each other in a way that made it impossible to isolate one from another. It was a symphony of unease, the kind of auditory phenomenon that seemed alive, reacting to the listener, pressing into the mind and refusing to let go. As the tape progressed, the nature of the voices became more disturbing. Intertwined among the cacophony were 2 voices that stood out, perfectly synchronized, carrying an unnatural harmony that suggested a single intelligence speaking through 2 mouths. They spoke in soft tones, almost conversational, but the words were deliberate, sharp, and chilling. "You shouldn't have come." The researchers' own nervous breaths and whispers could be heard reacting to the voices, but there was a hesitation in their tones, a pause that suggested they already knew resistance was futile. In several sections, the tape captured sudden bursts of laughter, high-pitched and layered, as if multiple beings were sharing the same amusement. The laughter didn't feel joyful, it was calculated, measured, as though the sound itself was part of some dark ritual, mocking anyone who dared intrude upon the hollow. The recording revealed other, subtler phenomena as well. Occasionally, voices mimicked the researchers themselves, repeating questions they had asked earlier, but with small variations that warped the meaning into something menacing. At times, the whispers seemed to come from different corners of the room at once, overlapping so precisely that it became impossible to determine the direction or distance of the source. Some moments even included faint echoes of children singing in perfect unison, though the melody was broken, dissonant, and suffused with an underlying malevolence. The deeper the tape went, the more apparent it became that these were not random voices, not merely echoes or recordings of prior events. They were alive, aware, interacting with one another and with the intruders in real time. By the final minutes, the recording captured a crescendo of layered sounds, overlapping pleas, calls of warning, and the 2 dominant voices repeating the same phrase over and over with perfect synchronization. The words were clear, chilling, and inescapable: "You shouldn't have come." After that, there was silence, thick, heavy, suffocating, followed only by the faint creak of the floorboards. Anyone listening could feel the weight of absence, the sense that something remained just beyond perception, watching, waiting, and aware. The tape became proof of what the locals had always feared: the hollow was alive, and the twins' descendants were the guardians of a force that could bend voices, minds, and reality itself to their will.